The paramedic told me later that my mother picked up on the first ring. She knew within 60 seconds that I was in an ambulance, that I had collapsed at work, that I was unresponsive for nearly 4 minutes before a colleague found me on the floor of the break room. She knew all of that. She still didn't come. I didn't find out until 3 days later, when I was sitting upright in a hospital bed with a drainage tube in my skull, and my husband's hand in mine, that the reason she hadn't come, the reason neither of my parents had come for 11 hours, was because my brother had rear-ended someone on the freeway and needed $340 to cover the other drivers before it turned into an insurance claim. $340. I had a subdural hematoma. My brain was bleeding, and my parents decided that my brother's fender bender was the more pressing emergency. I want to tell this story the right way, which means I have to start earlier, much earlier, because if I just tell you about the hospital, you'll think my parents are monsters, and the truth is more complicated and somehow worse than that. The truth is that they're not monsters. They're just people who decided, sometime before I was old enough to notice, that my brother Cody was the one worth protecting, and I was the one worth using. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed structural engineer. I've worked for the same firm in Denver since I was 24, and I have the kind of job where people call me when buildings aren't behaving the way they should. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because it matters to what comes next. The fact that I am a competent adult who has been paying her own rent since she was 22 and has never once asked her parents for money. My brother Cody is 28. He has lived with my parents in Tucson for most of his adult life, with a few scattered months here and there when things were going well, and he'd move into an apartment, and then they'd stop going well, and he'd move back. He's had 11 jobs in 6 years. Some of that is bad luck. Most of it is Cody. I love my brother. I want to say that clearly. I love him the way you love someone you grew up with. Someone who used to make you laugh. Someone who shares your memories of the house you grew up in and the smell of your mother's cooking on Sunday mornings. But I stopped excusing his behavior a long time ago, and I stopped excusing my parents' behavior even longer ago than that. My parents are not wealthy. My dad worked in HVAC repair for 30 years and retired at 62 with a modest pension and a house that's paid off. My mom did bookkeeping, part-time, for a dental office for most of my childhood. They're comfortable, not rich. But the financial dynamic in our family was never really about what they had. It was about It was about what I had. The first time they asked me for money, I was 25. They were something about the transmission, and they were short $800. I said yes without thinking about it. Of course I said yes. They were my parents. The second time, I was 26. Cody had lost his job at a distribution warehouse and needed help with his car insurance payment so he wouldn't lose his car. And could I maybe front him $350? He'd pay me back. He didn't pay me back. By the time I was 29, I had given my family, my parents and my brother in some combinations, somewhere around $14,000 over 4 years. I tracked it in a spreadsheet, not because I expected to be repaid. I tracked it because at some point I started to feel like I was going crazy, like I was imagining how often they called and what they called about, and I needed proof that I wasn't. My husband, Jonah, we'd been married 2 years at this point, knew about the money. We had talked about it. He was patient with me in the way that good people are patient when they love you and can see something you can't yet see about yourself. He never told me to stop. He asked me once, about a year into our marriage, "What do you think would happen if you said no?" I didn't have an answer. I had genuinely never tried. Here is what I knew about myself. I had spent my entire childhood being the child who was easy. The one who didn't need anything, didn't cause problems, made good grades, stayed out of trouble. Cody needed constant management, not because he was a bad kid, but because he was impulsive and messy and always in some kind of minor chaos. My parents gave him the attention that chaos requires. I got the kind of attention that goes to plants. Occasional, when someone remembered. I think I spent most of my 20s trying to buy the version of my parents that I needed them to be. If I was generous enough, reliable enough, available enough, they would eventually notice and reciprocate. That's not a rational belief. I know that now, but it was the operating system I was running on for a very long time. The Tuesday it happened, I was at work late. This was not unusual. I had a project review the following morning, and I was doing final checks on a load analysis report. I'd had a headache since Sunday, not a migraine, just a dull, persistent pressure behind my right temple that I kept meaning to deal with and kept putting off because I had a deadline. I'd taken ibuprofen 3 times in 2 days. It wasn't going away. At 4:17 p.m., I stood up from my desk to go to the break room for water, and that's the last things I remember clearly until I was in the ambulance. What I was told later. A colleague named Deborah found me on the floor of the break room. I had been unconscious for approximately 4 minutes. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes of her call. I was responsive but disoriented by the time they loaded me into the ambulance. My emergency contact on file. At work was Jonah. Jonah was called immediately. Jonah was in a meeting in Colorado Springs and started driving back the second he got the call. He was at the hospital by 6:30 p.m. At some point during transport, one of the paramedics, trying to be thorough, I think, trying to do right by me, also called my parents. It was 4:48 p.m. My mother answered on the first ring. What she was told, her daughter had collapsed at work, was being transported by ambulance, possible neurological event. They were taking me to St. Anthony's. What my mother said, according to the paramedic, who told me this story 3 days later, with an expression I will never forget. Okay. We'll try to get there as soon as we can. She did not ask which hospital. He had to repeat it. At 6:12 p.m., Jonah called my parents from the hospital waiting room to update them. My dad picked up. We're trying to figure out the Cody situation. My dad said, your mother is upset. Jonah asked what the Cody situation was. Cody had been in a minor fender bender on I-10 that afternoon. No injuries. The other driver wanted $340 in cash to not involve insurance. Cody didn't have $340. My parents were trying to pull it together. She's in the hospital, Jonah said. They think it might be a brain bleed. We know, my dad said. We'll be there. At 6:55 p.m., the neurologist confirmed a subdural hematoma, a slow bleed that had likely been developing for at least 48 hours, probably longer. She explained that they needed to relieve the pressure. She explained this to Jonah because I was not fully coherent and Jonah, as my husband, was absolutely the right person to be making decisions on my behalf. No one called my parents for their consent. Because, why would they? I was a married adult. My husband was there. This is not complicated, but I didn't know any of this when I woke up. I didn't know the timeline. I didn't know Jonah had been there for hours while my parents had been in Tucson. Trying to sort out Cody's car accident money, I woke up with a headache that felt like something had rearranged my furniture, a tube coming out of my head, and Jonah holding my hand. And I thought, okay, something bad happened, but I'm here, and he's here, and it's going to be fine. My parents arrived at 3:30 a.m. Almost 11 hours after the paramedic called my mother, they walked into my recovery room, smelling like coffee and the road, and my mother started crying. Immediately, and my dad kept patting my foot through the blanket in this helpless way he has. And I was so groggy and so relieved to see them that I didn't ask any questions. It took 3 days for the full picture to come together. Jonah told me about his call with my dad, the nurse who had been on shift that evening. Her name was Tamara, and she was the kind of direct, no-nonsense person who I immediately loved. Mentioned that she had flagged my chart because the family hadn't arrived for such a long time, and that she'd found it unusual given the severity of my situation. Sometimes people don't understand what neurological event means over the phone, she said carefully. Sometimes they think it's not that serious. And then the paramedic, when he came by to check on another patient on my floor and recognized my room number, stopped in the doorway. He was young, maybe 26, and he had the look of someone who had been thinking about something and had decided to say it. He told me that he had spoken to my mother, that he had told her clearly what was happening, that she had said they would try to get there. "I just want you to know," he said, "because I thought about it, and I think you should know." She understood what I was telling her. I thanked him. I waited until he left to cry. Jonah sat on the edge of my bed and didn't say anything for a while. "The Cody thing," I finally said. "Yeah." "How much?" $340. I did the math in my head, which was a strange thing to do with a healing brain. $340. We kept that much in a kitchen drawer for emergencies. We kept that much in the little envelope in the glove compartment of my car. $340 was what I spent on groceries in a slow month. My parents had left me unconscious and bleeding in an ambulance while they tried to figure out how to scrape together $40 for my brother's Fender Bender. I did not confront them in the hospital. I want to be clear about that. I was exhausted and I was injured, and I was on medication that made everything feel slightly behind glass. And I was not in a state to have the conversation I knew eventually needed to happen. So I let my mother hold my hand and tell me she'd been so scared. And I let my dad go down to the cafeteria and bring back terrible coffee. And I said the things you say. "I'm fine. I'm going to be okay. Don't worry." Jonah watched me do all of this. He didn't say anything. He knew me well enough to know I was making a decision, not avoiding one. I was discharged after 5 days, with a list of restrictions that would govern the next 3 months of my life. No heavy lifting. No high-stress situations. Limited screen time. Follow-up appointments every 2 weeks. My firm was generous. They had short-term disability coverage that I had never thought about before. And it kicked in automatically, and I was suddenly someone who had to stay home and rest and not work, which is genuinely one of the most disorienting things that has ever happened to me. My parents stayed for 2 days after my discharge, staying in our guest room, and then went back to Tucson. Before they left, my mother pressed $200 into my hand and told me to use it for something nice. I accepted it. I knew where that $200 came from. It came from the same place everything in my family came from: an attempt to approximate love through transactions. 2 weeks later, Cody called me. He'd heard I was doing better and was glad. He mentioned the accident, kind of sideways, the way he does, half apologetic and half oblivious. Then he said, "Hey, do you know if Mom and Dad asked you yet about helping out with the electric bill this month? Things have been tight." I said, "Cody, I just had brain surgery." "I know," he said. "That's why I figured they hadn't asked you yet." I told him I had to go. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. After I hung up, that was the moment, I think. Not the hospital. Not finding out they'd made me wait 11 hours while they chased down $340 for a fender bender. It was my brother calling 2 weeks after my surgery to see if I could cover the electric bill. That was when something finally solidified in me. Something that had been soft and pliable for my entire adult life just hardened into a shape I recognized. I was done. I didn't say anything yet. I needed time to decide exactly what I wanted to do. Because I have never been the kind of person who acts from anger. I don't like the decisions I make when I'm angry, and I knew I was angry, and I knew I needed to wait until the anger had settled into something cleaner. My therapist, who I had started seeing the previous year, and who deserved some kind of medal for the patience she demonstrated with me, suggested that I write down what I wanted. Not what I felt. What I actually wanted as an outcome. What I wanted. I wanted my parents to understand what they had done, not in a private conversation where my dad would stare at the table and my mother would cry and then nothing would change. I wanted them to understand in a way that had witnesses. 4 months after I was discharged, my firm held its annual professional development gala. It sounds fancier than it is. It's a banquet room at a Marriott. Rubber chicken. Open bar. A lot of people in business casual trying to network, but it was significant to me because that year, I was being recognized for a project I'd led the previous spring, a retrofit of a historic building in downtown Denver that had required some creative problem solving. My project manager had submitted the write-up for the recognition award. I had known for 6 weeks that I was receiving it. I invited my parents. I want you to understand this clearly. I invited them deliberately. My mother had always wanted to see me get recognized, had always made the kind of vague remarks about my career that suggested she was proud of me, but didn't quite understand what I did or why it mattered. I invited them because I wanted them there, because what I was planning required an audience, and they were part of the audience I needed. My parents drove up from Tucson. They stayed in the same guest room. My mother wore her good blouse. My dad complained about the parking downtown. Everything felt completely normal. I had been behaving normally. For 4 months, I am very good at behaving normally. The award was given during dinner, between the salad course and the entree. My project manager, a steady and deeply decent man named Harrison, gave a short speech about the building project and my role in it, and then he called me up to the front of the room. I stood at the podium. I had notes, but I didn't need them. "Thank you," I said. This project meant a lot to me, and I'm proud of the work our team did. I want to take a minute before I say anything else, though, because this feels like the right place to say some things that I've been holding for a while. I heard my mother shift in her chair. 4 months ago, I had a medical emergency. I collapsed at work. I was taken by ambulance to St. Anthony's with a brain bleed, a subdural hematoma. My husband was there within 2 hours. He made every decision that needed to be made. And he sat with me through all of it. The room was very quiet. These were my colleagues. They knew I had been out. Some of them had sent flowers. My parents were contacted by the paramedic at 4:48 p.m. I want to share a brief timeline because I think it matters. I glanced at my notes, though I had memorized every word. 4:48 p.m. Paramedic calls my mother. She is told I am unconscious and possibly experiencing a neurological event. 6:12 p.m. My husband calls my parents to update them. He is told they are handling a family situation. 6:55 p.m. I am diagnosed with a subdural hematoma and taken into surgery. 3:30 a.m. My parents arrive. They were delayed because my brother had been in a Fender bender and needed $340 to avoid an insurance claim. I looked at my parents. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My dad was staring at the tablecloth. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. I'm telling it because I've spent 10 years being the reliable one in my family. The one who shows up and pays the bills and answers the phone. I've given my family approximately $14,000 over the past 6 years. I tracked it. Not because I wanted to be repaid, but because I needed to know I wasn't imagining it. I paused. I was not imagining it. I set my notes on the podium. I'm done. Effective last month, I have stopped supplementing my family's finances. I have changed my emergency contact at work to my husband, where it should have been all along. And I wanted my parents to hear me say this in a room full of people who respect me, so that we're all very clear about where things stand. I picked up the award. Thank you again, Harrison. And thank you all. This really does mean a lot to me. I walked back to my table and sat down. Jonah put his hand on mine under the table. My dad stood up. I had anticipated this. I had genuinely thought it through, what he might do, how this might go. But watching him push his chair back and stand up in a banquet room full of my colleagues, his face red, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not regret, something almost like calm. He said my name. He said it loudly. Several people turned. You don't do this, he said. You don't air family business in front of what? I didn't bring strangers into family business, I said, very quietly. I brought family business to the people who matter to me. Harrison, to his enormous credit, was already moving toward our table. My dad looked around the room, looked at my mother, looked at me. And then he sat back down. My mother was crying. She cried for the rest of the evening. She did not speak to me. They left the next morning before I woke up. My mother called me 4 days later. We talked for a long time. Longer than we had talked in years. She said a lot of things. She said she hadn't realized. She said she was sorry for the hospital. She was truly sorry. She had panicked about Cody because she always panicked about Cody. And she knew that wasn't fair. She said she didn't know it had been $14,000. She said she was ashamed. I believed most of it. I believed she was sorry in the way people are sorry when they get caught. Not exactly false, but not quite the full thing either. I told her that I didn't need her to feel bad. I needed things to actually be different, that I wasn't cutting off contact. I wasn't declaring some dramatic permanent estrangement. I was just telling her clearly, for the first time in my life, what I would and wouldn't do. I would not send money. I would not be the backup plan for Cody's crises. I would come for Christmas if the dynamic was different. I would call on Sundays, but I was done performing devotion that wasn't reciprocated, and I was done letting the fear of being unloved make my financial decisions for me. She cried again. I waited it out. My dad has not called me directly. I expect that will take longer. Men like my dad. Men who've spent their whole lives not talking about hard things. Don't usually start when they're in their 60s. I'm not waiting for it. I've made my peace with the version of him that probably exists, which is a man who loves me in whatever way he knows how, which has never quite been enough, and never quite wasn't either. Cody called about 6 weeks after the gala. He'd heard about what I said from my mom. He didn't seem angry exactly. Cody doesn't really do anger, he does wounded, and he said he thought it was heart mush, what I'd done. He said I'd embarrassed the family. You've been getting $340 Fender benders handled by your parents since you were 25. I said. I was in surgery. There was a long pause. I didn't know it was that serious. he said. Yes, you did, I said. Mom told you the day it happened. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm working on some stuff, he said finally. I know things need to be different. I said I hoped they would be. I meant it. The leaves were changing outside my office window when I finally felt normal again. Not hospital normal. Or recovery normal. But the regular kind of normal. Where you sit at your desk and you have a cup of coffee. And you look a load calculation and you don't think about anything except the numbers in front of you. It took about 8 months to get there. Jonah made dinner that night. Pasta. Nothing fancy. And we ate at the kitchen table. And talked about things that had nothing to do with my family, which is its own kind of miracle. When you think about how much space they used to take up in my head, at some point he said, "You seem different lately." Different how? Lighter, he said. Like you put something down. I thought about that for a moment. $14,000, I thought. 11 years of waiting to matter enough. A very long time of confusing obligation with love. Yeah, I said. I think I did.